You have never woken up in true darkness. I know you think you have. You have been in a dark room. You have closed your curtains and turned off your phone and pulled the blankets over your head and thought that is darkness. But it is not. There is always light leaking in from somewhere. The glow of a street lamp through the curtain edge. The tiny green dot of a smoke detector on the ceiling. The faint blue hum of an appliance in the kitchen. There is always something. Your world is never truly dark. But if you were to fall asleep tonight and wake up tomorrow morning in a medieval village in the year 1320, in a small farming settlement somewhere in the English countryside, you would open your eyes and see nothing. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. A darkness so complete and so total that you would not be able to see your own hand in front of your face. You would lie there in the black, disoriented, unsure for a moment whether your eyes are actually open or still closed, and you would feel a kind of darkness that modern human beings almost never experience. A darkness that is not just the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Something heavy and thick and alive, pressing against your skin, filling your lungs, wrapping around you like a blanket made of shadow. And in that darkness, you would hear things. Not the sounds you are used to, not cars or air conditioning, or the hum of electricity or the distant rumble of an airplane. You would hear the wind. You would hear the creak of timber above your head, the wooden frame of the house shifting and settling in the cold. You would hear something scratching in the thatch of your head, a mouse probably, or maybe a rat, burrowing through the straw that serves as your roof. You would hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the people sleeping next to you, because you are not sleeping alone. Nobody sleeps alone in medieval England. You would hear from somewhere outside the low murmur of a cow, and beyond that, so faint that you might be imagining it, the sound of a rooster beginning to stir, not yet crowing, but rustling on its perch, sensing that dawn is close even though the darkness shows no sign of breaking. This is how every day begins in a medieval village. Not with an alarm clock, not with a phone buzzing on a nightstand, not with the gradual brightening of electric lights on a timer. With darkness, with cold, with the sounds of animals and wind and the creaking of a house that was built by hand from materials that came from the earth within walking distance of where you are lying. And the first thing you would feel, before your eyes adjust, before your brain fully wakes, before you remember where you are or what century you are in, is cold. A deep, penetrating, bone-level cold that has nothing to do with the temperature outside and everything to do with the fact that the fire went out sometime in the middle of the night and nobody got up to feed it. And this is where I want to begin our journey tonight. Not with kings or castles or knights in shining armour. Not with battles or sieges or political intrigue. I want to begin with the cold house in the dark, in a small village that no history book has ever mentioned. On an ordinary morning in an ordinary year, in the life of an ordinary person who never did anything that anyone would consider historically significant. Because this is where most of the Middle Ages actually happened. Not in the throne rooms and the battlefields that fill the pages of history books. In the houses. In the fields. In the kitchens and the barns and the gardens and the lanes and the churches and the market squares of 10,000 small villages scattered across the medieval countryside, where millions of people lived and worked and ate and slept and laughed and cried and were born and died without ever once making it into the historical record. These people are the Middle Ages. The kings and the knights are the exception. The villagers are the rule. And their daily lives, their routines, their habits, their small pleasures and constant hardships are so different from anything you have ever experienced that they might as well be living on another planet. And yet they are your ancestors. Their blood is in your veins. Their world is the foundation on which your world was built, and understanding how they lived, really understanding it, not the romanticized version from movies and television, but the actual gritty, exhausting, surprisingly beautiful reality of it, is one of the most fascinating things you can do with your imagination. So let us start with the house, because the house is where the day begins, and the house itself is a story. The house you are lying in is not what you would call a house by modern standards. It is a single room. One room. That is the entire house. There are no bedrooms. There is no bathroom. There is no kitchen. at least not as a separate space. There is no hallway, no closet, no attic, no basement. There is one room, roughly 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, and everything that happens in your domestic life happens in this room. You sleep here. You eat here. You cook here. You work here when the weather is too bad to be outside. Your children play here. Your grandmother dies here. Everything. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which sounds like a building material from a fairy tale, but which is actually a very practical and very common construction technique. The frame of the house is made of oak timbers, thick, rough-hewn beams that were cut from the local woodland and shaped with axes and adzes. Between the timbers, the walls are filled with wattle, a lattice of woven hazel or willow branches, something like a very large basket turned on its side, and over the wattle on both sides is daubed a thick layer of daub, a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and water that is smeared on by hand and left to dry into a hard, surprisingly durable surface. When it is fresh, daub smells exactly like what it is, a mixture of mud and manure. When it dries, the smell fades, mostly though. On damp days, a faint earthy odour rises from the walls that never entirely goes away. The floor is dirt, packed earth, tamped down hard by years of foot traffic until it is almost as solid as concrete, but still dirt. In some houses, the floor is covered with rushes, the dried stems of marsh plants that are gathered in the summer and spread across the floor like a rough carpet. The rushes serve several purposes. They provide a layer of insulation between your feet and the cold earth. They absorb spills and drips in the inevitable mess of daily life. And when they become too dirty or too matted or too infested with fleas, which happens regularly, they are swept out and replaced with fresh ones. The smell of fresh rushes is one of the characteristic smells of a medieval house, a clean, green, slightly sweet scent that briefly masks the other, less pleasant smells of close human habitation. The roof is thatch. Thick bundles of straw or reeds bound together and layered over a framework of wooden rafters, creating a roof that is surprisingly waterproof, surprisingly wall-proof, surprisingly warm, and surprisingly long-lasting. A well-made thatch roof can last 20 years or more before it needs to be replaced. But thatch has drawbacks. It harbours insects and rodents. Mice and rats live in the thatch, burrowing through it, nesting in it, and occasionally falling through it into the room below, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. And thatch is flammable, terrifyingly flammable. A single spark from a hearth, carried upward by the heat of the fire, can ignite the straw and turn the entire roof into a sheet of flame in minutes. House fires are one of the most common disasters in medieval villages, and when one house catches fire, the flames often spread to the neighbouring houses because the buildings are close together and the thatch roofs are connected by the dry grass and straw that litters the ground between them. A fire that starts in one house can consume an entire village in an hour. But let us not dwell on catastrophe. Let us return to the dark house in the early morning, because the fire, or rather the absence of fire, is the first problem of the day, and solving it is the first task. The hearth is in the centre of the room, not against a wall, as you might expect, but in the middle of the floor. This is important, and it is something that surprises most people who think about medieval houses. The hearth is a shallow depression in the earth floor, lined with flat stones, and it is where the fire burns. There is no chimney. I need to repeat that because it is hard to believe. There is no chimney. The smoke from the fire rises straight up from the hearth, fills the upper part of the room, and gradually finds its way out through gaps in the thatch, through the open door, through cracks in the walls, through whatever openings are available. The result is that the upper half of the room is almost always filled with a haze of smoke. The lower half, where you are lying on your straw mattress on the floor, is relatively clear, which is why everything in a medieval house happens close to the ground. You sit on the floor or on low benches. You eat from bowls placed on low tables or on the floor itself. You sleep on the floor. The smoke fills the space above your head like a permanent indoor cloud, and you learn to live beneath it. The smoke is unpleasant, but it serves a purpose. It preserves the thatch. The chemicals in the smoke, the tars and the creosote, coat the straw of the roof and make it less hospitable to insects and less prone to rot. A smoky house has a longer-lasting roof than a house with good ventilation. So the medieval villager makes a trade-off, one of many trade-offs that define daily life in this era. You accept the smoke, the stinging eyes, the cough that never quite goes away, the clothes that always smell of wood smoke, in exchange for a roof that lasts longer and a house that costs less to maintain. It is not a choice that anyone would make today. But in a world where replacing a roof means weeks of labour, and where the materials for a new roof must be gathered by hand from the surrounding landscape, it is a choice that makes perfect sense. Now, the fire has gone out overnight. This is not unusual. Keeping a fire burning through the night requires someone to wake up periodically and add fuel, and on most nights, no one bothers. The result is that the house is cold in the morning, and the first task of the day before anything else can happen is to restart the fire. And restarting a fire in the year 1320, without matches, without a lighter, without any of the easy ignition sources that you take for granted, is not a trivial task. The usual method is to use a fire steel and a piece of flint. The fire steel is a curved piece of iron, about the size of your palm, with a rough surface. You hold it in one hand and strike it sharply against the edge of a piece of flint, which is a very hard type of stone that occurs naturally in the chalk deposits of southern England. When the steel strikes the flint, tiny fragments of iron are sheared off the steel by the sharp edge of the flint, and these fragments are so small and so hot from the friction of the impact that they ignite spontaneously, producing a shower of tiny sparks. The sparks fall onto a piece of tinder, which is a bundle of very dry, very fine, very flammable material, usually charred cloth, dried fungus, or the fluffy seed heads of certain plants. If a spark lands on the tinder and catches, the tinder begins to glow, not with a flame but with a tiny, fragile, smouldering ember barely visible in the dark, like a single red pixel on a black screen. And here is where skill and patience come in, because the ember is not yet a fire. It is a possibility of fire, a hope of fire, a prayer of fire. You must take this tiny glowing ember, cradle it in a nest of very dry, very fine kindling, and blow on it, gently, steadily, carefully, coaxing the ember into a flame without blowing it out. Too much air and the ember dies. Too little air and the ember fades. You must find the exact right amount of breath, the exact right angle, the exact right distance, and sustain it, breath after breath, until the ember catches the kindling and a flame appears. And even then you are not done. The flame is small and fragile, and you must feed it, first with tiny twigs, then with slightly larger sticks, then with bigger pieces of wood, building the fire gradually, layer by layer, until it is large enough and hot enough to sustain itself. On a good morning, the whole process takes 5 or 10 minutes. On a bad morning, when the tinder is damp or the flint is dull or the kindling is wet, it can take much longer. And on a very bad morning, when nothing will light and the cold is seeping into your bones and the children are shivering and the cow needs milking and the day's work is waiting, the simple act of starting a fire can feel like the most frustrating task in the world. But this morning, let us say the fire catches quickly. The tinder glows, the kindling glows, the flaming catches. The flame grows, and as the fire builds, the room begins to change. The darkness retreats. The cold loosens its grip. The smoke begins to rise, filling the upper part of the room with its familiar grey haze. And the light of the fire, warm and orange and flickering, illuminates the interior of the house, revealing the details that the darkness had hidden. You can see the straw mattresses on the floor, stuffed with dried bracken or oat straw, lumpy and thin, nothing like the mattresses you were used to. You can see the rough woolen blankets, heavy and scratchy, that kept you warm through the night. You can see the wooden pegs driven into the wall beams, where clothes and tools hang. A pair of leather shoes, worn and patched. A woman's linen hood, a woolen cloak stained with mud and grease. A sickle with a wooden handle, a clay jug, a wooden bucket. The possessions of the household are few and functional. There is almost nothing in this house that exists purely for decoration or entertainment. Everything serves a purpose. Everything is used until it breaks. and then it is repaired, and then it is used again until it cannot be repaired anymore, and then it is repurposed into something else. Against one wall there is a crude wooden table, low to the ground, scarred and stained from years of use. Beside it, a few wooden bowls, a wooden spoon, a single iron knife. On a shelf above, a clay pot with a lid, containing the household supply of salt, which is one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world, essential for preserving meat and fish and for adding flavour to an otherwise bland diet. Salt is so valuable that it is sometimes used as a form of currency, and the word salary, which you use every day without thinking about it, derives from the Latin word salarium, which originally referred to the allowance given to Roman soldiers to buy salt. And here, on this cold morning, with the fire beginning to warm the room and the light beginning to push back the darkness, the first meal of the day is prepared. And I use the word meal loosely because breakfast in a medieval village is not what you would recognize as a meal. It is not a sit-down affair with plates and cutlery and choices. It is a quick, functional intake of calories designed to get you through the first few hours of hard physical labor. And the menu, if you can call it that, does not change. It is the same thing every morning, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. It is pottage. Pottage is the default food of the medieval peasant, and if you could taste only one dish from the entire Middle Ages, this would be the one, because this is what most people ate most of the time. Pottage is a thick soup or stew made by boiling whatever ingredients are available in a pot of water over the fire. The base is usually grain, either oats or barley, which are cheaper and more readily available in England than wheat. To the grain is added whatever vegetables are in season: onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, turnips, and whatever herbs are growing in the garden, parsley, sage, thyme, garlic. The pot hangs over the fire on a hook or sits on a trivet in the coals, and it simmers continuously, sometimes for days, with new ingredients added as old ones are consumed. The pottage at the bottom of the pot, the stuff that has been cooking for days, is thick and starchy and deeply flavoured, a concentrated essence of everything that has been added to it over the course of the week. Meat appears in the pottage occasionally, but not often. Most medieval peasants eat meat only a few times a month, and when they do, it is usually pork or bacon or salted fish rather than the beef or chicken or lamb that you might expect. Cattle are too valuable as draught animals to be slaughtered for food except on special occasions. Chickens are kept for their eggs, not their meat. Sheep are kept for their wool. The pig is the peasant's primary meat animal. Because pigs are cheap to keep, they eat almost anything that can be turned loose in the woodland to forage for acorns and beech mast, and they reproduce quickly. A single sow can produce 2 litters of 8 to 12 piglets per year, which is a rate of return that no other livestock animal can match. But on an ordinary morning, the pottage is meatless. It is grain and vegetables and water and whatever flavour the herbs provide. It is served in wooden bowls, eaten with wooden spoons or simply drunk from the bowl. There is bread too, sometimes. A heavy, dark, coarse loaf made from rye or barley or a mixture of grains, nothing like the light, fluffy, white bread you were used to. Medieval bread is dense and chewy and slightly sour, with a thick, dark crust that can actually be difficult to bite through. The bread is often several days old because baking is a labour-intensive process that most households do only once or twice a week. And fresh bread is a luxury that is enjoyed briefly and then replaced by the slowly hardening remainder of the loaf. And to drink, there is ale. Not the ale you know, not the carefully crafted, precisely hopped, amber-coloured beverage that you might order at a pub. Medieval ale is a cloudy, murky, thick, slightly sweet liquid that bears almost no resemblance to modern beer. It is made from malted barley brewed in the household or purchased from the village alewife, and it contains no hops, which are not widely used in English brewing until the 15th century. Without hops, the ale does not keep well. It begins to sour within a few days of brewing, which means it must be consumed quickly and brewed frequently. The alcohol content is low, much lower than modern beer, perhaps 2 or 3%, which makes it more of a nutritional beverage than an intoxicant. And everyone drinks it. Men, women, children, everyone. Not because they are all drunkards, but because the ale is safer than the water. The water supply in a medieval village is not treated, not filtered, not purified in any way. It comes from wells and streams and ponds that are shared with livestock, and that receive runoff from dunghills and latrines and all the other sources of contamination that are unavoidable in a pre-modern settlement. Drinking untreated water is a gamble, and while the medieval villager does not understand the germ theory of disease, they understand through long bitter experience that people who drink water tend to get sick more often than people who drink ale. The brewing process, which involves boiling the water, kills most of the dangerous pathogens, making ale a much safer beverage than raw water. So the morning meal is pottage, bread, and ale, eaten quickly, without ceremony, in the flickering light of the fire. The whole thing takes perhaps 15 minutes, and then, with the food sitting warm and heavy in your stomach, it is time to go outside. And going outside in a medieval village in the early morning is an experience that would assault every one of your senses simultaneously. If you have been enjoying this journey into the medieval world, if you have been lying in the dark imagining the smoky interior of a medieval house and the taste of barley pottage and the smell of fresh rushes on a dirt floor, then I want you to know that this is only the beginning. The day has barely started. The fields are waiting. The animals need tending. The village is waking up. And the story of what happens between sunrise and sunset in a medieval farming community is so rich and so detailed and so full of surprises that I could talk about it for hours. And I will. But if you want to be here for the whole journey, if you want to walk through the fields and meet the miller, and watch the blacksmith work and sit by the fire at the end of the day, while someone tells a story that has been passed down for 100 generations, then do something small right now. Subscribe. That is all. Just tap the button. It takes less time than it took a medieval villager to strike a spark from a fire steel, and it means that the next time I tell a story like this, you will be there to hear it. And leave a comment, because I am genuinely curious about something. What surprised you most about the medieval house? Was it the lack of chimney, the dirt floor, the fact that everyone slept in one room, or the fact that children drank ale? Tell me. I read every comment, and the things you notice are often the things I would never think to talk about, which makes the next story better. And drop a like, because every like is a tiny signal that says this kind of storytelling matters. And honestly, in a world of 30-second clips and clickbait headlines, I think it does. Now, let us step outside. You push open the door, which is a heavy wooden plank on crude iron hinges. And the first thing that hits you is the light. Not bright, blazing sunlight. This is England, and the morning light is grey and soft and filtered through a low ceiling of cloud that seems to hang just above the treetops. But after the darkness of the house, even this dim, overcast light seems almost painfully bright, and you squint and blink for a moment as your eyes adjust. The second thing that hits you is the smell, and this is where the modern visitor to a medieval village would struggle most, because the smell of a medieval settlement is powerful and complex and, by modern standards, overwhelming. The dominant note is animal dung, from the cattle and pigs and chickens and sheep that live in and around the village, and from the dunghill, the communal pile of manure that sits at the edge of the settlement and that grows throughout the year until it is carted out to the fields in the spring as fertilizer. Beneath the dung, there are other smells. Wood smoke from the fires burning in every house, wet earth from the unpaved lanes that turn to mud at the slightest rain, straw and hay from the barns and the thatched roofs, the sharp, acrid smell of the privy pit, which is exactly what you think it is, a hole in the ground behind the house where the household deposits its human waste. And beneath all of these, a general, pervasive smell of human bodies, of sweat and unwashed skin and clothes that are worn for days or weeks without laundering, because laundry is a back-breaking, time-consuming process that is done infrequently and only for the garments that can withstand the harsh treatment of medieval washing methods. But here is the thing about the smell. You would notice it intensely for the first few minutes, and then you would stop noticing it. Your nose would adapt. The smells would fade into the background, becoming part of the invisible infrastructure of daily life, no more noticeable than the hum of a refrigerator or the buzz of fluorescent lights in your own world. The medieval villager does not notice the smell because the medieval villager has never known anything else. This is what the world smells like. This is normal. The third thing you would notice is the sound, or rather the quality of the sound, because a medieval village in the early morning is both quieter and louder than you would expect. It is quieter because there is no mechanical noise, no engines, no motors, no fans or pumps or compressors, no electrical hum, the constant background drone that you are so accustomed to that you do not even hear it anymore. The ambient noise of the modern technological world is completely absent, and in its place there is a silence, a deep, rich, textured silence that is populated by sounds of a completely different kind. The crowing of roosters, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the clatter of wooden buckets, the creak of cartwheels, the thud of an axe splitting wood, the voices of people calling to each other across the lane in an English that you would barely recognize, thick with dialect and peppered with words that have not been used for 700 years. These sounds are sharp and clear and individual, each one distinct, each one identifiable, each one a piece of information about what is happening in the village at this moment. The modern world drowns its sounds in a wash of mechanical noise. The medieval world lets each sound stand on its own, naked and clear, like individual notes in a piece of music played without accompaniment. You step out into the lane. The lane is not paved. It is a track of bare earth, muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry, rutted by the wheels of carts and pocked by the hooves of animals. On either side of the lane, the houses of the village stand in a rough row, each one similar to the one you just left. Wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, small gardens or crofts behind each house, enclosed by wicker fences, where the household grows its vegetables and herbs. Behind the gardens, the land opens out into the fields, the great open fields that are the economic foundation of the village, stretching away in long, narrow strips toward the distant tree line of the parish boundary. The village is waking up. Doors are opening. Figures are emerging, wrapped in rough woolen cloaks against the morning chill. A woman crosses the lane carrying a wooden pail, heading for the well. A man leads an ox out of a byre, the animal's breath steaming in the cold air. Two children run past, barefoot despite the cold, chasing a dog that has stolen something from the kitchen. An old man sits on a bench outside his door, coughing into his hand, watching the world with the patient, unhurried gaze of someone who has seen 10,000 mornings just like this one and expects to see 10,000 more. And beyond the village, stretching away in every direction, the fields are waiting. The great open fields, divided into strips, each strip belonging to a different family, each family owing labour and rent and a share of their harvest to the lord of the manor. The fields are where most of the village's waking hours will be spent. The fields are where the food comes from. The fields are, in every meaningful sense, the reason the village exists. And that is where we are going next. Out through the village gate, if there is a gate, or simply down the lane and through the gap in the hedge, and into the fields where the real work of the medieval day begins. The work that feeds the village. The work that feeds the Lord. The work that feeds the church. The work that keeps everyone alive for one more season, one more year, one more generation, in this quiet, demanding, endlessly repetitive, strangely beautiful life that is so different from your own and yet so deeply, fundamentally, inescapably human. The fields are waiting. The morning is cold, the light is grey, and the day is just beginning. The field does not look like a field, not to your modern eyes. If I transported you to a medieval English farming village in the year 1320 and pointed at the fields and said, "There, that is where the food comes from," you would stare at the landscape in front of you and feel confused because what you would see does not match anything in your experience of what a farm looks like. There are no fences. There are no hedgerows dividing one person's land from another. There are no neat rectangular plots separated by roads and ditches. What you see instead is an enormous open expanse of land, hundreds of acres, stretching from the edge of the village to the distant tree line, and this expanse is divided not into separate farms, but into long narrow strips, each one about a furlong in length, which is 220 yards, and about a chain in width, which is 22 yards. The strips run parallel to each other like the lines on a page, and each strip is separated from its neighbour not by a fence or a wall, but by a narrow, unploughed ridge of grass, barely a foot wide, called a balk. And the strips do not all belong to the same person. They are scattered. Your family might own a strip here, and then your neighbour owns the next 3 strips, and then another family owns 2 strips, and then you own another strip 50 yards away, and then someone else owns the strip next to that. Your land is not a single contiguous block. It is a patchwork, a mosaic, fragments of fields scattered across the great open expanse like pieces of a puzzle that have been deliberately separated and mixed up. This system, which historians call the open field system, is one of the most distinctive features of medieval English agriculture, and it seems bizarre and inefficient to modern eyes. Why would you scatter your strips across the field instead of consolidating them in one place? Why would you waste time walking from one strip to another when you could farm a single block much more efficiently? The answer, as with so many things in the medieval world, has to do with fairness. The land in the village is not all the same quality. Some areas are well drained and fertile. Some are wet and boggy. Some are on slopes that catch the sun. Some are in hollows that are prone to frost. If each family were given a single contiguous block, some families would end up with all the good land, and some would end up with all the bad land, and the unlucky families would starve while the lucky ones prospered. The strip system solves this problem by distributing the risk. Every family gets some good strips and some bad strips, some well-drained strips and some boggy strips, some sunny strips and some shady strips. Nobody gets the best of everything, but nobody gets the worst of everything either. It is a system designed for survival, not for maximum production. And in a world where one bad harvest can mean the difference between life and death, survival matters more than efficiency. Now let me take you into the field itself, because the work that is about to happen here is unlike anything you have ever done. And it is harder than anything you can imagine. The time of year determines everything. If it is autumn, you are ploughing. If it is spring, you are ploughing again. If it is summer, you are weeding and tending and watching the grain grow and praying that the weather holds. If it is late summer, you are harvesting, the most intense and most important work of the entire year. And if it is winter, you are repairing tools, mending fences, tending livestock, and waiting for the cycle to begin again. The rhythm of the agricultural year is the rhythm of medieval life, and it is a rhythm that governs everything, not just the work in the fields, but the dates of festivals, the timing of marriages, the schedule of church services, the pattern of eating and fasting, and even the names of the months. The medieval villager does not live by the clock. The medieval villager lives by the season. But let us say it is early October and the autumn ploughing is underway, because the ploughing is where the story of the medieval farm really begins. The plough used in medieval England is called a heavy plough or a moldboard plough, and it is a remarkable piece of technology, one of the most important agricultural innovations of the Middle Ages. The basic principle is simple. The plough cuts into the earth with a vertical blade called a coulter, slices horizontally beneath the surface with a flat blade called a share, and then turns the cut soil over with a curved plate called a moldboard. The result is a deep, clean furrow of turned earth, with the topsoil inverted so that the weeds and crop stubble from the previous season are buried beneath fresh soil and the nutrients from below are brought to the surface. But the heavy plough is not simple to operate. It is large, heavy, cumbersome, and requires enormous pulling power to drag through the dense, heavy clay soils of lowland England. A single family does not own a plough. The plough belongs to the village, or rather, it belongs to a cooperative group of families who pool their resources to purchase and maintain it. And the pulling power comes from oxen, not horses, not yet, at least not in most parts of England in 1320. Horses are faster than oxen, but more expensive to feed and more fragile. Oxen are slower but stronger, cheaper to maintain, and, crucially, when they reach the end of their working life, they can be slaughtered for beef and leather, whereas a dead horse is worth almost nothing. The choice between horses and oxen is an economic calculation, and for most medieval farmers the calculation favours oxen. A full plough team consists of 8 oxen, yoked in pairs, harnessed to the plough and driven by a ploughman who walks behind the plough. gripping the handles and steering the blade through the soil, and a driver who walks beside the oxen, guiding them with voice commands and occasionally with a goad, a long stick used to prod the animals when they slow down or veer off course. 8 oxen is a lot of oxen. Most families do not own 8 oxen. Most families own 1 or 2, maybe 3 if they are prosperous. So the plough team is assembled from the collective livestock of several families, each one contributing their animals to the team in exchange for the right to have their strips ploughed. This cooperative arrangement is one of the defining features of medieval agriculture, and it means that farming is never a solitary activity. It is always communal. You cannot plough alone. You need your neighbours, their oxen, their labour, their cooperation, and they need yours. The plough team is a social institution as much as an agricultural one, and the relationships forged in the fields, the bonds of mutual dependence and mutual obligation, are the glue that holds the village together. The actual process of ploughing is grueling. The ploughman walks behind the plough all day, gripping the handles, leaning into the frame, using his body weight to keep the blade at the correct depth. The soil resists. The plough bucks and kicks as it hits stones and roots. The handles vibrate with every impact, sending shocks up through the ploughman's arms and into his shoulders and back. By the end of the day, his hands are raw, his shoulders ache, his back is stiff, and his legs are heavy with fatigue, from walking miles back and forth across the field. And he does this every day for weeks, until all the strips in the field are ploughed and ready for planting. The driver has a different kind of exhaustion. He walks beside the lead pair of oxen all day, talking to them, coaxing them, keeping them in line, managing the team. Oxen are not machines. They have personalities. Some are cooperative and steady. Some are stubborn and prone to stopping without warning. Some are nervous and easily spooked. Managing a team of 8 large animals, each with its own temperament, while walking through rough, uneven ground, is a skill that takes years to develop, and a good driver is valued almost as highly as a good ploughman. And the furrow itself is a unit of measurement, as well as a feature of the landscape. A furlong, which is one of the oldest units of length in the English language, literally means furrow long. It is the distance that a team of oxen can plough in a single pass before they need to rest and turn around. 220 yards, about 1/8 of a mile. This is how the medieval mind measures distance, not in abstract units but in terms of work. A furlong is not a number, it is an experience. It is the length of a ploughed furrow, the distance between one turning and the next, the rhythm of the day, broken into segments of effort and rest. Now, once the field is ploughed, it must be planted, and the timing of planting is critical, because the crops that are planted in the autumn are different from the crops that are planted in the spring, and getting the timing wrong can mean the difference between a full harvest and a failed one. And this brings me to one of the most important concepts in medieval agriculture, a concept that is rarely discussed in popular accounts of the Middle Ages, but that is absolutely essential for understanding how the system works. That concept is crop rotation. The medieval village does not plant the same crop in the same field every year. If it did, the soil would quickly become exhausted, the yields would decline, and within a few years, the field would be virtually useless. Instead, the village divides its arable land into 2 or 3 great fields, and each field follows a rotation cycle. In a 2-field system, which is the older and simpler method, one field is planted while the other lies fallow, resting for a year to allow the soil to recover. The planted field and the fallow field swap every year, so each piece of land is cultivated 1 year out of 2. This means that at any given time, half the village's arable land is producing nothing, which is a significant limitation on food production. The 3-field system, which became increasingly common in England from the 13th century onward, is more productive. In this system, the arable land is divided into 3 great fields, and each field follows a 3-year cycle. In the first year, the field is planted with a winter crop, usually wheat or rye, which is sown in the autumn and harvested the following summer. In the second year, the same field is planted with a spring crop, usually oats, barley, or legumes, such as peas and beans. which is sown in the spring and harvested in late summer or early autumn. In the third year, the field lies fallow, resting and recovering its fertility. Then the cycle begins again. The three-field system is a significant improvement over the two-field system for several reasons. First, it increases the amount of land under cultivation at any given time from 1/2 to 2/3, which means more food from the same total acreage. Second, the inclusion of legumes in the rotation, peas and beans in particular, actually improves the soil because legumes have the remarkable ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their root nodules. The medieval farmer does not understand the chemistry behind this process, but they understand the result. They know from centuries of experience that a field planted with peas or beans one year will produce a better grain crop the following year. They do not know why. They just know that it works, and that is enough. Third, the three-field system provides a more varied and more nutritious diet because the spring-planted legumes provide protein and essential amino acids that the winter-planted grains lack. A diet of bread and pottage supplemented with peas and beans is significantly more nutritious than a diet of bread and pottage alone, and the shift to the three-field system may have contributed to the gradual improvement in health and nutrition that occurred in parts of England during the 12th and 13th centuries. But the three-field system also has its limits. The fallow year is essential for the recovery of the soil, and the temptation to skip the fallow and plant all three fields every year is constant, especially in years when the harvest is poor and food is scarce. But skipping the fallow is a false economy. It provides a short-term boost in production at the cost of long-term soil degradation, and communities that skip the fallow too often find that their yields decline steadily over time until the land becomes virtually unproductive. Managing the rotation, maintaining the discipline to leave 1/3 of the land idle even when people are hungry, is one of the most important responsibilities of the village community, and it requires a kind of collective self-restraint that is not always easy to sustain. Now, while the ploughing and planting are happening in the fields, there is another whole sphere of work happening back in the village, and it is work that is just as important as anything that happens in the field. This is the care of animals. Livestock are not a luxury in a medieval village, they are a necessity. Without animals, the entire agricultural system collapses. The oxen pull the plough. Without them, the heavy clay soils of lowland England cannot be cultivated at all. The cattle produce manure, which is the primary source of fertilizer for the fields. Without manure, the soil becomes exhausted and the yields plummet. The sheep produce wool, which is one of England's most valuable export commodities and which provides the raw material for the clothing that keeps the villagers warm through the long cold winters. The pigs provide meat. The chickens provide eggs. The geese provide feathers for bedding and quills for the few people in the village who can write. Every animal in the village serves a purpose, and every purpose is essential. But keeping livestock alive through the medieval year is a challenge that modern farmers, with their heated barns and their manufactured feed and their veterinary medicine, can barely imagine. The fundamental problem is food. Livestock need to eat. And in a medieval village, there is no manufactured feed, no hay baler, no silo full of silage. The animals eat what the land provides, and what the land provides varies enormously with the seasons. In the summer, feeding the animals is easy. The village common, a large area of unenclosed pasture land that is shared by the entire community, provides abundant grazing for cattle, sheep, and geese. The pigs are turned loose in the woodland, where they forage for acorns, beech mast, roots, and whatever else they can find on the forest floor. This practice, called pannage, is so important to the medieval economy that the right to graze pigs in the woodland is one of the most jealously guarded privileges of the peasant community, and disputes over pannage rights are among the most common causes of conflict between neighbouring villages and between villages and their lords. But in the winter, feeding the animals becomes a crisis. The grass stops growing, the common is bare. The woodland is stripped of its acorns and beech mast, and the only feed available is the hay that was cut and dried in the summer and stored in the barn, and whatever straw and chaff is left over from the grain harvest. There is never enough. There is never and never enough. The amount of hay that a medieval village can produce and store is limited by the amount of meadowland available for cutting. and meadowland is always in short supply, because meadow is some of the most valuable land in the village, and every acre of it is already spoken for. The result is that every winter, the village faces an agonizing decision: which animals to keep and which to kill. There is not enough feed to sustain the entire herd through the winter, so some animals must be slaughtered in the autumn, their meat salted and preserved for winter consumption. The animals that are kept alive are the most valuable, the breeding stock, the best milkers, the strongest oxen, and they are fed on reduced rations through the winter, growing thin and weak, barely surviving until the spring grass begins to grow again and they can be turned out to graze and recover. This annual cycle of summer abundance and winter scarcity shapes the entire pattern of medieval life. The great festivals of the medieval calendar, many of which survive in modified form today, are key to this cycle. Michaelmas on September 29 marks the end of the harvest and the beginning of the autumn slaughter. Martimas on November 11th is the traditional date for the final slaughter of livestock before winter and the salting and preserving of the meat that will sustain the village through the lean months. Christmas in late December falls at the darkest and coldest point of the year, a moment when the community needs celebration and feasting to sustain morale through the long winter ahead. And Easter in the spring celebrates not just the resurrection of Christ, but the resurrection of the land itself, the return of warmth and light and growth after the cold, dark, hungry months of winter. And I want to tell you about one animal in particular, because its role in medieval village life is so important and so overlooked that it deserves special attention. I want to tell you about the cow. The cow is arguably the most important animal in a medieval village, more important than the ox, which does the heavy work in the fields, more important than the sheep, which produces the valuable wool, more important than the pig, which provides the primary source of meat. Because the cow provides something that none of the other animals can provide: milk. And milk in a medieval village is not just a beverage, it is a lifeline. A good medieval cow produces perhaps 1 to 2 gallons of milk per day during the summer months, when the grazing is plentiful. By modern standards, this is a pitiful amount. A modern dairy cow, the product of centuries of selective breeding and optimal nutrition, can produce 8 to 10 gallons per day. But in a world where calories are scarce and protein is even scarcer, 1 to 2 gallons of milk per day is a treasure. The milk is drunk fresh by the children and the elderly, who are most vulnerable to malnutrition. It is churned into butter, which provides essential fats and which can be stored for weeks or months without spoiling. It is made into cheese, which provides concentrated protein and which can be stored even longer than butter. And the whey, the liquid left over after the cheese is made, is fed to the pigs, who convert it into meat. Nothing is wasted. Every drop of milk that the cow produces is used, directly or indirectly, to sustain human life. The care of the cow is primarily women's work, like much of the daily labour that does not involve the heavy field work of ploughing and harvesting. The women of the household are responsible for milking, which is done twice a day, morning and evening. They are responsible for churning the butter, which is a tedious armishing process that involves agitating the cream in a wooden churn for up to an hour, until the fat globules coalesce into butter. They are responsible for making the cheese, which involves heating the milk, adding rennet to curdle it, separating the curds from the whey, pressing the curds from the whey, pressing the curds into moulds, and aging the cheese in a cool, dry place. And they are responsible for feeding and watering the cow, mucking out the byre, and tending to the animal's health, which, in the absence of veterinary medicine, means relying on a combination of practical experience, herbal remedies, and prayer. The relationship between a medieval woman and her cow is intimate and personal in a way that is difficult for a modern person to understand. The cow is not just livestock. The cow is not just livestock. The cow is a member of the household, almost a member of the family. The woman knows the cow's personality, its moods, its preferences. She talks to it while she milks. She worries about it when it is sick. She mourns it when it dies. And when a cow dies, the loss is not just emotional, it is economic. A cow is one of the most valuable possessions a peasant family can own, worth as much as an entire year's rent in some cases. Losing a cow to disease or accident can push a family from subsistence to starvation, and the records of medieval manorial courts are full of cases involving disputes over cattle, thefts of cattle, injuries to cattle, and the complex legal arrangements surrounding the lending, leasing, and inheritance of cattle. Now I want to take you to the village commons, because the commons is one of the most important and most misunderstood institutions of medieval life, and understanding it is essential for understanding how the entire system works. The commons is an area of land that belongs to no individual but is shared by the entire village community. It typically includes several different types of land: pasture for grazing livestock, woodland for gathering firewood and timber, and for pannage, wasteland for collecting materials like turf for fuel and rushes for floor covering, and sometimes a village pond or stream for fishing and washing. The commons is not a free-for-all. It is regulated by custom, by tradition, and by the decisions of the village community meeting, sometimes called the manor court or the hall mote, which meets regularly to settle disputes, enforce rules, and make collective decisions about the management of the village's shared resources. The right to use the commons is not unlimited. Each family is allowed to graze a specified number of animals on the common pasture, to collect a specified amount of firewood from the common woodland, and to gather a specified quantity of other materials from the common wasteland. These rights, called common rights, are attached to the family's landholding and are passed down from generation to generation along with the land itself. The system of common rights is designed to prevent overuse. If everyone were allowed to graze as many animals as they wanted on the common pasture, the pasture would quickly become overgrazed, the grass would be destroyed, and the land would become useless. This problem, which modern economists call the tragedy of the commons, was well understood by medieval communities, even though they did not have a name for it, and they developed a sophisticated set of rules and customs to prevent it from happening. The rules specify how many animals each family can graze, what times of year the commons is open for grazing, which areas are reserved for hay cutting and which for pasture, and what penalties are imposed on anyone who violates the rules. These rules are enforced by the community itself, through the manor court, and through the social pressure of living in a small, tight-knit village where everyone knows everyone and where violations of the common rules are noticed and remembered and gossiped about and punished with the most effective weapon in the medieval arsenal: social disapproval. In a world where your survival depends on the cooperation of your neighbours, the fear of being ostracized, of being labelled as greedy or untrustworthy or a bad neighbour, is a powerful deterrent against antisocial behaviour. The commons is not maintained by law enforcement in the modern sense. It is maintained by community, by the web of mutual obligation and mutual surveillance that binds the village together. And the commons is not just an economic institution, it is a social one. The common pasture is where the village's animals graze together, watched over by a communal herdsman or by the village children, who are assigned the task of keeping the animals from straying. The woodland is where the villagers gather not just firewood, but also mushrooms, berries, nuts, and the wild herbs that supplement their diet and provide the raw materials for their medicines. The village pond is where the geese swim, and where the women wash clothes, and where the children play in the summer. The commons is, in a very real sense, the village's living room, the shared space where the community comes together, where children learn the skills of animal husbandry by watching the older children and the adults, where news and gossip are exchanged, where relationships are formed and maintained. The commons is also the place where the village's sense of collective identity is most strongly felt. The commons belongs to everyone. It is the physical embodiment of the idea that the village is a community, that the people who live here have a shared stake in the land, and a shared responsibility for its management. When a villager walks across the common pasture, they are walking on land that is theirs, not in the sense of individual ownership, but in the sense of collective belonging. The commons is the village's commons, and the village is a community because it has commons. The two concepts are inseparable, and this is a good moment to pause and reflect on something that is easily overlooked when we think about the Middle Ages. We tend to think of medieval society as hierarchical and oppressive, and in many ways it was. The peasants owed rent and labour to the Lord owed service to the king. The whole system was built on obligation and subordination. But within the village itself, there was a surprising degree of communal decision-making, of collective self-governance, of what we might almost call democracy, though the medieval villager would not have used that word. The village managed its own affairs. It regulated its own commons. It settled its own disputes. It chose its own officials, the reeve, the hayward, the ale-taster, the constable, all elected by the community to serve for a term and then replaced. The Lord set the broad parameters, the rents, the labour obligations, the legal framework, but within those parameters the village governed itself. And this tradition of local self-governance, of communities managing their own affairs through collective decision-making, is one of the enduring legacies of the medieval village. A legacy that would survive the enclosures, the Industrial Revolution, and the transformation of rural England, and that can still be seen today in the parish councils and town meetings of the English countryside. The morning is growing warmer now. The grey cloud cover is beginning to thin, and occasional shafts of pale sunlight break through, illuminating patches of the field in a brief golden glow before the clouds close again. The plough team is moving steadily across the field, the oxen plodding, the ploughman leaning into his work, the driver walking alongside, calling out to the animals in a voice that is part command and part encouragement. In the village, the women are milking, the children are watching the geese on the common, and somewhere, from the direction of the mill, there is a low, steady, rumbling sound, like distant thunder, that tells you the water wheel is turning and the grain is being ground. The day is moving forward. The village is alive with the quiet, steady, purposeful activity of people who know exactly what needs to be done and who do not need to be told to do it. There is no supervisor. There is no manager. There is no timetable posted on a wall. There is only the work, the season, the land, and the deep ingrained knowledge of what the land requires at this moment, on this day, in this week, in this month, in this year. The knowledge is not written down. It is carried in the bodies and the minds of the people who do the work, passed down from parent to child, from neighbour to neighbour, from generation to generation, in an unbroken chain of practical wisdom that stretches back centuries. And ahead of us, in the village itself, there are more stories to discover. The mill with its great stone wheels grinding the grain. The blacksmith with his forge and his anvil, shaping the iron that the village depends on. The baker with her oven, the only oven in the village, where everyone brings their bread to be baked. The church with its bell, marking the hours of the day and the seasons of the year. The children playing in the lane. The women at the well. The old men sitting in the sun, remembering winters that were harder and summers that were sweeter, and a world that was, perhaps, not so different from this one after all. All of that is waiting for us, and the day is still young. There is a sound that controls everything. It is not a voice. It is not a command shouted by a lord or a steward or a bailiff. It is a bell, a single bronze bell, hanging in a small stone tower at the western end of the only stone building in the village, the church. And this bell rings throughout the day, at intervals that are not determined by a clock, because there are no clocks in a medieval village, but by the canonical hours, the schedule of daily prayers established by the Church centuries ago and observed, at least in theory, by every Christian community in Europe. The bell rings at dawn for prime. It rings at mid-morning for terce. It rings at noon for sext. It rings at noon for sext. It rings at mid-afternoon for none. It rings at sunset for vespers. And it rings at nightfall for compline. 6 times a day, the bell cuts through the sounds of village life, through the lowing of cattle and the creak of the mill wheel and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the laughter of children playing in the lane, and for a brief moment everything pauses. Not stops. Not quite, but pauses. A woman lifting a bucket from the well might glance toward the church and cross herself. A man bent over his strip in the field might straighten his back and murmur a prayer. A child might stop running and look up at the tower, counting the strokes, not because the child is particularly devout, but because the bell is the closest thing the village has to a public clock, and counting the bells is how you know what time it is and how much of the day remains. The church itself is the heart of the village in a way that is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. It is not just a place of worship. It is the only public building. It is the meeting hall, the courthouse, the community centre, the school, the library, the art gallery, and the emergency shelter, all rolled into one. when the manor court meets to settle disputes and enforce the village's rules, it meets in the church. When the village needs to make a collective decision about the commons, or the crop rotation, or the repair of a bridge, the discussion happens in the church. When a travelling friar arrives to preach, he preaches in the church. When the village is threatened by flood or fire or invasion, the church is where people gather for safety, because the church is the only building in the village made of stone, and stone does not burn. The interior of the church is the most colourful and most visually stimulating space in the village. The walls are covered with paintings, not the sophisticated oil paintings of the Renaissance, but bold, bright, slightly crude murals depicting scenes from the Bible and the lives of the saints. The Last Judgment is a favourite subject, with Christ enthroned in glory at the top and the damned being dragged into the jaws of a monstrous hell mouth at the bottom, their faces contorted in agony, demons with pitchforks prodding them into the flames. These paintings are not decorative. They are educational. In a community where almost nobody can read, the paintings are the primary medium through which the stories and teachings of Christianity are communicated. The walls of the church are the village's Bible, translated from words into images, and the images are designed to be vivid and memorable, and, in the case of the Hellmouth paintings, absolutely terrifying. The church also contains the village's most valuable objects, the chalice and paten used for communion, usually silver or silver gilt. The vestments worn by the priest, embroidered with gold thread. The reliquary, a decorated container holding a relic, perhaps a bone fragment or a piece of cloth purported to have belonged to a saint. These objects are locked in the church's sacristy and brought out only for services, and they represent a concentration of wealth that is vastly disproportionate to the poverty of the surrounding village. The church is rich while the villagers are poor, and this disparity is a source of both pride and resentment. Pride, because the beauty of the church and the value of its treasures reflect well on the community that supports it. Resentment, because the church's wealth comes from the tithes and offerings of the villagers, who are required by law and custom to give 1/10 of their annual produce to the church. A significant burden for families that are already living close to the edge of subsistence. The priest is a figure of enormous importance in the village, though his actual character and competence vary wildly. Some medieval parish priests are educated, devout, and genuinely dedicated to the spiritual welfare of their flock. Others are barely literate, more interested in their own comfort than in the souls of their parishioners, and indistinguishable in their daily habits from the peasant farmers they serve. The church authorities issue regular complaints about priests who neglect their duties, who keep mistresses, who brew and sell ale, who spend more time hunting and hawking than praying and preaching. But for better or worse, the priest is the village's primary connection to the wider world of learning and literacy. He is often the only person in the village who can read and write, and his services are required for everything from writing letters and drafting legal documents to recording births, marriages and deaths in the parish register. But the church, for all its importance, is not where most of the village's daily activity takes place. The real life of the village unfolds in the workshops and the workplaces and the houses and the lanes that surround the church. And the most important of these workplaces, the one that the entire village depends on more directly than any other, is the mill. Now here is something that surprises most people who think about medieval life. You cannot grind your own grain. You are not allowed to. It is literally against the law. The mill belongs to the lord of the manor, and the lord has a monopoly on grinding. Every family in the village is required to bring their grain to the lord's mill and pay a fee called a multior for the privilege of having it ground. The multior is typically 1/16 or 1/24 of the grain, which might not sound like much, but when you are living on the edge of subsistence, losing even a small fraction of your grain to the miller's toll is a hardship, and the mill monopoly is one of the most resented features of the manorial system. The mill itself is a remarkable piece of engineering. The most common type of mill in medieval England is the water mill, which harnesses the power of a stream or river to turn a large wooden wheel, which in turn drives a pair of massive circular stones, one fixed and one rotating, that grind the grain into flour. The technology is ancient, dating back to the Roman period, but the medieval watermill is a refined and sophisticated version, capable of grinding hundreds of pounds of grain per day and serving as the primary flour supply for an entire village. The miller is one of the most important and most distrusted people in the village. Important because everyone depends on him for their flour. Distrusted because the milling process is opaque, literally happening behind closed doors, and the opportunities for cheating are numerous. The miller controls the grain from the moment it enters the mill to the moment the flour comes out. And there is no easy way for the farmer to verify that the correct amount of flour has been returned. The suspicion that the miller is skimming, taking more than his legal share of the grain, is so widespread and so deeply ingrained in medieval culture that the dishonest miller becomes a stock figure in medieval literature. Chaucer's miller in the Canterbury Tales is described as a thief who steals grain and charges 3 times the legal toll, and this characterization would have been instantly recognizable to Chaucer's audience, not because every miller was a thief, but because the suspicion of thievery was so universally attached to the profession that it had become a cliché. But honest or dishonest, the miller is indispensable. Without the mill, there is no flour. Without flour, there is no bread. Without bread, there is no survival. The mill is, in its own quiet way, as important to the village as the church and the sound of the millstones grinding. A low, steady, rhythmic rumbling that can be heard from one end of the village to the other is as much a part of the soundtrack of medieval life as the church bell. Now let me take you to another workshop, because there is another craftsman in the village who is just as essential as the miller, though for entirely different reasons. I want to take you to the blacksmith. The blacksmith's forge is easy to find. You follow the sound, a rhythmic, ringing, metallic clang that carries across the village like a second bell. Less musical than the church bell, but more urgent, more physical, more alive. The forge is a small, open-sided building at the edge of the village, set apart from the other houses because of the fire risk, and as you approach, you feel the heat before you see the fire. The forge is hot. Intensely, oppressively, wonderfully hot, especially on a cold October morning, and the warmth draws people to it the way a flame draws moths. The forge is one of the social gathering places of the village, a place where men come to watch the smith work, to gossip, to warm their hands, and to wait for their tools to be repaired. The blacksmith is working iron, and iron is the most important industrial material in the medieval world. Iron makes the ploughshare that cuts the earth. Iron makes the coulter that slices through the soil. Iron makes the sickle that harvests the grain. Iron makes the axe that fells the trees. Iron makes the nails that hold the buildings together. Iron makes the horseshoes that protect the hooves of horses and draft animals. Iron makes the hinges on the doors, the hooks on the walls, the chains on the wells, the rims on the cart wheels. Without iron, the entire material infrastructure of medieval life collapses. And without the blacksmith, there is no iron. Or rather, there is no way to shape raw iron into the tools and implements that the village needs. The smith's raw material is wrought iron, which is iron that has been smelted from ore and hammered into bars or billets by an ironworker. The smith buys or barters for these iron bars and then shapes them into finished products using heat and hammer. The process is simple in concept but demanding in execution. The iron bar is placed in the forge, a bed of glowing charcoal fed by a bellows that forces air into the coals and raises the temperature to the point where the iron becomes soft and malleable, glowing a bright cherry red, or even a white-hot yellow. The smith then pulls the hot iron from the forge with long-handled tongs, places it on the anvil, and hammers it into shape, working quickly because the iron cools rapidly and must be returned to the forge and reheated if it cools too much before the shaping is complete. The skill of the blacksmith lies in knowing exactly how hot the iron needs to be for each operation, exactly how hard to strike, and at exactly what angle, and exactly when to quench the finished piece in water or oil to harden and temper it. These are skills that are learned through years of apprenticeship, watching and imitating a master smith, and they cannot be learned from a book, even if books were available, because the judgment involved is tactile and visual and intuitive, based on the color of the glowing metal and the feel of the hammer on the anvil, and 100 other subtle cues that can only be acquired through practice. The blacksmith is one of the few people in the village who works with a material that is not produced locally. The iron comes from outside the village, bought from travelling merchants or obtained at the nearest market town. This makes the smith dependent on the wider economy in a way that most villagers are not. And it also makes him relatively wealthy by village standards, because his skills are specialised and irreplaceable, and his services are in constant demand. And beside the smith, or nearby, there is another essential figure, the baker. And the baker's story involves something that you might not expect, an oven. Here is something that most people do not realise about medieval cooking. Most medieval houses do not have ovens. They have hearths, open fires in the centre of the room, and they cook by boiling, roasting on a spit, or frying in a pan. But baking, which requires the sustained, even, enclosed heat of an oven, is not something that most households can do at home. Ovens are expensive to build, expensive to fuel, and dangerous to operate in a house with a thatched roof. So in most medieval villages, there is one oven, and it belongs either to the lord of the manor or to the baker, and everyone in the village brings their bread dough to this oven to be baked, paying a fee for the service. The baker, like the miller, holds a monopoly, and like the miller, the baker is both essential and resented. The fee for baking is a burden. The suspicion that the baker is using too much fuel and underbaking the bread, or that the baker is skimming dough from the loaves, is constant. And the quality of the bread varies widely depending on the skill and honesty of the baker. But the bread that comes out of the oven, whatever its quality, is the staple food of the village, the foundation of the diet, the thing that fills bellies and sustains life from one harvest to the next. Medieval bread comes in many grades, and the grade you eat depends on your social status and your wealth. The finest bread, called wastel or manchet, is made from finely sifted white wheat flour and is soft, light, and delicious. But this bread is expensive, and only the wealthy eat it regularly. The bread that most villagers eat is made from a coarser mixture of wheat and rye, or sometimes from rye alone, or from barley, or from a blend of whatever grains are available. This bread is dark, dense, heavy and chewy, with a thick crust that can be genuinely difficult to bite through. The coarsest bread of all, sometimes called horse bread, is made from peas, beans, and whatever grain is cheapest, and it is the food of the very poor, the bread of last resort, eaten only when nothing better is available. But even bad bread is better than no bread, and the baker's oven, smoking and crackling at the edge of the village, is a lifeline that the community cannot do without. Now, I want to tell you about a day that breaks the routine of village life. A day that the entire community looks forward to, with an anticipation that borders on excitement. I want to tell you about Market Day. Market Day happens once a week, usually on a fixed day, and it takes place not in the village itself, but in the nearest market town, which might be 3 miles away or 5 miles away or 5 miles away, or in some cases as much as 10 miles away. Getting there requires walking, because nobody in the village owns a horse for riding, and the journey takes an hour or two in each direction, which means that market day is essentially a full-day commitment. But the walk is worth it, because market day is the medieval village's window to the wider world. The market town has things that the village does not have: salt, iron, leather, pottery, cloth that is finer and more colourful than anything the village can produce, spices, occasionally, brought from unimaginably distant lands by merchants who speak languages that no one in the village has ever heard, news, gossip, rumours from beyond the parish boundary, from the county, from London, from the continent, from the Holy Land. Market Day is the day when the narrow, insular, inward-looking world of the village opens up, just a crack, and the wider world peers in. The market itself is a noisy, crowded, chaotic affair, held in the open square of the market town, with temporary stalls set up on wooden trestles and goods displayed on tables and on the ground. The sellers are a mixture of local producers, farmers from the surrounding villages selling their surplus grain, cheese, eggs and livestock, and travelling merchants, peddlers and chapmen who carry their goods from market to market on pack horses or in handcarts. The buyers are the villagers themselves, along with the servants and agents of the local gentry, who come to the market to purchase supplies for their households. The transactions are conducted partly in money and partly in barter. Coins exist, but they are scarce in the countryside, and many exchanges are made in kind. A bushel of wheat for a length of cloth, a dozen eggs for a pound of salt, a day's labour for a jug of ale. The medieval economy is not a fully monetized economy, especially at the village level, and the skills of bargaining, of assessing the value of goods, of calculating equivalences between different commodities are essential skills that every adult in the village possesses. Market day is also a social event. People who have not seen each other since the last market day meet and catch up. Young men and young women from different villages encounter each other, and romances begin because the village itself is too small and too inbred to provide a sufficient pool of potential marriage partners. Disputes are settled, deals are struck, alliances are formed, and the ale stalls do a brisk business because the combination of long walking, hard bargaining, and social excitement makes people thirsty, and the market town's ale is reputed to be better than the village's. Though whether this is actually true or simply a product of the novelty effect is a matter of eternal debate. If this journey through a medieval village has been stirring something in you, if you have been lying in the dark imagining the sound of the church bell and the heat of the forge and the smell of fresh bread from the baker's oven, then I want you to know that you are not just listening to a history lesson, you are participating in an act of remembrance. You're remembering a world that your ancestors built and inhabited and loved and struggled in. And that act of remembrance is important because the medieval village is not just a quaint relic of the past, it is the foundation of the modern world. The systems of land management, of communal governance, of crop rotation, of market economics that were developed in medieval villages are the ancestors of the systems that govern your life today. You are the product of 1,000 years of village life, whether you know it or not. And if that connection between past and present moves you, if it makes you feel something that you were not expecting to feel, then do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel, because the journey is far from over, and there are so many more stories to tell about the world that made us who we are. Leave a comment telling me which medieval tradesperson you would want to be if you had to choose. The miller with his monopoly and his bad reputation, the blacksmith with his fire and his skill, the baker with her oven and her loaves, or someone else entirely. I want to know. And hit the like button, because every like is a small act of rebellion against a world that wants everything fast and short and shallow. And this story is none of those things. Now let me tell you about the children, because the children of a medieval village live a life that is so different from the life of a modern child that the comparison is almost absurd. Medieval children do not have a childhood in the modern sense. There is no extended period of play and education and gradual preparation for adult life. By the age of 5 or 6, a medieval child is working. Not full-time, not at the heaviest tasks, but working. Contributing to the household. Pulling their weight. A 5-year-old might be responsible for gathering eggs from the hen house. A 6-year-old might be assigned to watch the geese on the common, keeping them out of the crops and away from the road. A 7-year-old might be helping in the garden, pulling weeds and picking vegetables. An 8-year-old might be carrying water from the well or gathering firewood from the hedgerows. And by the age of 12, a boy is working in the fields alongside the men, and a girl is doing the full range of domestic work alongside the women. But this does not mean that medieval children do not play. They play constantly, in the margins of the day, in the gaps between tasks, in the few free hours that the rhythm of work allows. They chase each other through the lanes. They climb trees. They swim in the river in the summer, despite the danger, because medieval rivers are deep and cold and the currents are unpredictable, and drowning is one of the leading causes of death among medieval children. They play with animals, with dogs and cats and the barnyard poultry. They play games that have been played by children for centuries, games that you would recognize, variations of tag and hide and seek and blind man's buff and king of the hill. And they play with things. Not toys in the modern sense, not manufactured playthings bought from a store, but objects that they find or make themselves. A stick becomes a sword, a rag becomes a doll, a stone becomes a missile, a hoop from a barrel becomes a toy to roll along the ground with a stick, A pig's bladder, blown up and tied off, becomes a ball that can be kicked and thrown and fought over in games that are the distant ancestors of modern football and rugby. The ingenuity of medieval children in converting the raw materials of daily life into objects of play is a testament to the human imagination, and it is also a reminder that play is not something that depends on toys. Play is something that children do with whatever is available, and the simpler the material, the more creative the play. But the lives of medieval children are also shaped by dangers that modern children do not face. Disease is the biggest killer. Infant mortality is staggering by modern standards. Roughly 1 in 3 children dies before the age of 5, and roughly 1 in 2 dies before the age of 15. The diseases that kill them are the diseases of crowding and poor sanitation, dysentery, measles, whooping cough, tuberculosis, and the ever-present danger of epidemic diseases like plague, which arrived in England in 1348 and killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Accidents are the second biggest killer. Medieval village life is full of hazards that modern children are shielded from. Open fires, deep wells, unguarded ponds, heavy animals, sharp tools, cartwheels, mill wheels. A child who falls into an unguarded well or wanders too close to a working mill wheel or is kicked by a spooked horse can be killed or crippled in an instant. And the coroner's records of medieval England are full of cases involving the accidental deaths of children, each one recorded in a brief formulaic entry that is heartbreaking in its matter-of-factness. A child aged 3 fell into a ditch of water and was drowned. A boy aged 7 was playing near the mill and was caught by the wheel and killed. A girl aged 5 was sitting by the fire and her clothes caught flame and she was burned and died the following day. These entries are reminders that the medieval world, for all its beauty and its charm and its community and its deep connection to the land, is also a dangerous world. A world without safety nets, without emergency services, without the hundreds of small protections and precautions that modern society puts in place to keep its children alive. The medieval villager accepts this danger as a fact of life, not with indifference, but with a kind of resigned acceptance that comes from living in a world where death is always close and always unpredictable. They mourn their dead children, they grieve, but they also move on, because there is work to be done, and the living need tending, and the fields will not plough themselves. And now I want to talk about the women, because the women of a medieval village do more work than anyone, and their work is the least visible and the least appreciated, both in their own time and in ours. The division of labour in a medieval village is roughly along gender lines, though the lines are not absolute. Men do the heavy field work, the ploughing and the sowing and the harvesting. Women do everything else. And everything else is a lot. A medieval village woman's day begins before dawn and ends after dark. She lights the fire. She prepares the morning meal. She milks the cow. She feeds the chickens and collects the eggs. She carries water from the well, which involves multiple trips because the wooden bucket holds only a few gallons and the household needs water for drinking, cooking, washing, and watering the garden. She tends the garden, weeding, watering, harvesting vegetables and herbs. She spins wool or flax into thread using a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that she twirls between her fingers while pulling fibers from a mass of raw wool or flax held in her other hand. Spinning is one of the most time-consuming tasks in the medieval household, because every piece of cloth, every garment, every blanket, every sack, every piece of rope starts as raw fiber that must be spun into thread before it can be woven or knitted into anything useful. A medieval woman spins constantly, whenever her hands are free, while watching the children, while walking to the well, while waiting for the pottage to simmer. The drop spindle is her constant companion, and the image of the woman spinning is so deeply embedded in medieval culture that the word spinster, which originally meant simply a woman who spins, eventually came to mean an unmarried woman, because spinning was such a universal and defining female activity. She also brews ale. In most medieval villages, ale brewing is women's work, and the village alewife is a recognized and important figure. Brewing is done at home in the household's largest pot, and the finished ale is sold to neighbours and passers-by, providing the household with a small but significant source of income. The quality of the ale varies widely, and the village appoints an official called an ale taster, usually a man, to sample each batch and ensure that it meets minimum standards of quality and that the price charged is fair. She also does the laundry, which in the medieval world is a major undertaking. Clothes are washed by soaking them in a trough of water mixed with lye, a caustic alkaline solution made by filtering water through wood ash and then pounding them with a wooden paddle or trampling them with bare feet. The process is harsh on the hands and hard on the fabric, and clothes are washed as infrequently as possible to preserve them. The wealthier households send their laundry out to be done by professional washerwomen, but in a peasant household, the washing is done by the women of the family, usually at the village pond or stream, which serves as a communal laundry as well as a source of drinking water for livestock. And she cares for the sick and the elderly. In the absence of professional doctors, which the village cannot afford in any case, medical care falls to the women of the household, who use a combination of herbal remedies, prayer and practical nursing to treat illness and injury. Their pharmacopoeia is derived from centuries of accumulated folk knowledge, and some of their remedies are genuinely effective. Willow bark tea, which contains salicin, the chemical precursor of aspirin, is used to reduce fever and relieve pain. Honey is used to dress wounds, and modern research has confirmed that honey has genuine antibacterial properties. Mint and fennel are used to settle upset stomachs, and lavender is used as a sedative, rubbed on the temples or placed under the pillow to promote sleep. Other remedies are less scientific. Amulets and charms are worn to ward off disease. Prayers are offered to specific saints who are believed to have power over specific ailments. And in extreme cases, the village wise woman, a figure who occupies an ambiguous position between herbalist and healer, and who is sometimes suspected of witchcraft, may be consulted for remedies that the church would not approve of. The woman's work is never done. That phrase, which has become a cliché in modern usage, is literally true in the medieval village. There is always another task, another chore, another demand on her time and her energy. And the work is relentless, not just because there is so much of it, but because so much of it is repetitive. The same meals cooked every day. The same clothes washed every week. The same clothes washed every week. The same cow milked every morning and every evening. The same thread spun hour after hour, day after day, month after month. The repetition is numbing, and it is one of the things about medieval life that is hardest for modern people to comprehend. We live in a world of variety and novelty, where boredom is considered a problem to be solved and stimulation is available at the touch of a screen. The medieval village woman lives in a world where the work is always the same, and the diversions are few, and the horizon of possibility is bounded by the parish boundary. And yet the women of medieval villages are not passive victims of their circumstances. They are active, resourceful, creative people who find meaning and satisfaction, and even joy in the lives they lead. They take pride in their skills, in the quality of their ale, in the flavour of their cheese, in the fineness of their thread. They gossip and laugh and sing while they work. They form deep friendships with their neighbours and support each other through the crises of birth and death and illness that punctuate village life. They exercise influence over their households and their communities in ways that the formal power structures of medieval society do not acknowledge, but that are real and significant nonetheless. The afternoon is advancing now. The sun, such as it is, has passed its highest point and is beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. The shadows are lengthening, the light is softening, and the pace of work in the village is beginning to slow, not because anyone has decided to stop, but because the body knows its limits and the day has been long and the evening is coming. And the evening, in a medieval village, is a world of its own, a world of firelight and shadow, of food and drink and talk and story, of the small, intimate human rituals that mark the transition from day to night, from work to rest, from the public world of the field and the lane and the market, to the private world of the field and the lane and the market, to the private world of the house and the hearth and the hearth and the family. That world is waiting for us now. The fire is being built up, the pottage is simmering, the ale is being poured, and outside, in the gathering dusk, the last sounds of the day are fading. The bell for vespers, the the lowing of cattle being brought in from the common, the distant laughter of children being called home for supper. The evening is coming, and it has stories to tell. The afternoon in a medieval village has a texture that is completely different from the morning. The morning is sharp, the morning is urgent, the morning is cold, hands and empty stomachs, and work that cannot wait. But the afternoon is softer, the afternoon is slower, not because the work stops, it does not, but because the quality of the work changes. The heavy labour of the morning, the ploughing and the hauling and the lifting and the carrying, gives way to lighter tasks, to mending and sorting and organising and preparing. The body, which has been burning calories at a ferocious rate since dawn, begins to feel the accumulated fatigue of the day. The muscles ache. The joints stiffen. The hands, raw and calloused from gripping tools all morning, move more slowly, more carefully, as if the fingers themselves are tired of working and are asking, quietly, for permission to rest. But rest is still hours away, because the afternoon is when the evening meal is prepared, and in a medieval household, preparing the evening meal is not a 30-minute affair involving a refrigerator and a microwave. It is a multi-hour process that begins in the early afternoon and continues until dusk, and it involves every woman in the household and, frequently, the children as well. The centerpiece of the evening meal is, once again, pottage, the pot that has been hanging over the fire since morning, or in some cases since several mornings ago, is inspected, stirred and replenished. Whatever vegetables are available are chopped and added. An onion pulled from the string of onions hanging from the rafters. A handful of dried peas, soaked since the morning in a wooden bowl. A few leaves of cabbage from the garden, wilted and yellowing but still edible. A bunch of parsley, chopped fine and thrown in at the last moment to add a burst of green freshness. And, if the household is fortunate, if there has been a recent slaughter, or if the father has managed to trap a rabbit or snare a bird, a piece of meat, browned in the fire and then dropped into the pot to simmer with the vegetables. But most days there is no meat. Most days the pottage is what it always is, a thick, starchy vegetable and grain soup that tastes of onion and smoke and the faint earthiness of the iron pot it has been cooking in. And most days that is enough. Not exciting, not varied, not what you would choose if you had a choice, but enough, filling, sustaining, the kind of food that keeps you alive and keeps you working and does not ask to be admired. The bread for the evening meal was baked earlier in the week and has been slowly hardening ever since. By now, 3 or 4 days after baking, the crust is like wood and the interior is dense and dry. To make it edible, the bread is often cut into thick slices called trenchers and used as plates, with the pottage ladled over them. The bread absorbs the liquid from the pottage and softens enough to eat, and the trencher serves double duty as both tableware and food. After the meal, you eat your plate. There is no waste in a medieval kitchen. There is no waste anywhere in a medieval household. Everything is consumed, everything is repurposed, everything is used until it cannot be used anymore, and then it is composted or fed to the pigs or burned for fuel. And then there is the ale. The evening ale is the day's reward, the one small luxury that even the poorest family allows itself. The ale is poured from a clay jug into wooden cups, and it is drunk slowly, savoured, because the next batch will not be ready for several days and what remains in the jug must last. The ale is cloudy and warm and slightly sweet, with a flavour that changes subtly from day to day as it ages, growing sharper and more acidic as the week progresses. Fresh ale is best. 3-day-old ale is tolerable. Week-old ale is sour and unpleasant, but it is drunk anyway, because even sour ale is safer than water, and because wasting food or drink of any kind is a sin that the medieval conscience takes seriously. Now I want to tell you about the brewing process itself, because it is fascinating and because it reveals something important about the economics of medieval village life. Brewing ale in medieval England is primarily women's work, and the woman who brews is called an alewife. Almost every household brews its own ale at some point, but some women are better at it than others, and these women brew more frequently and sell their surplus to their neighbours, operating a small-scale commercial enterprise from their homes. The alewife signals that she has ale for sale by placing a bush or a bundle of twigs on a pole outside her door, a sign that is the ancestor of the modern pub sign, and customers come to her house, sit at her table or on benches outside, and drink the ale on the premises or carry it away in their own jugs. The brewing process is straightforward but time-consuming. The alewife begins with malted barley, which is barley that has been soaked in water until it begins to sprout, and then dried in a kiln to stop the sprouting process. The sprouting converts the starches in the grain into sugars, which is essential because it is the sugars that the yeast will ferment into alcohol. The malted barley is then crushed and mixed with hot water in a large wooden tub, a process called mashing, which extracts the sugars from the grain. The resulting liquid, called wards, is drained off, boiled, allowed to cool, and then mixed with yeast, which is often obtained from the dregs of the previous batch. The mixture is left to ferment for a day or two, and the result is ale. Medieval ale contains no hops. Hops, which give modern beer its characteristic bitter flavour and which also act as a preservative, are not widely used in English brewing until the 15th century. Without hops, the ale is sweet rather than bitter, and it spoils quickly, usually within a week. This means that brewing is a constant, ongoing process. The alewife is always brewing, always fermenting, always starting a new batch as the old one runs out. It is an endless cycle of mashing and boiling and fermenting and serving, and it runs parallel to the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and spinning and gardening that fills the rest of the woman's day. The alewife's commercial activity is regulated by the village authorities. The ale taster, an official appointed by the manor court, visits the alewife whenever she puts up her bush, tastes the ale, checks the measure to make sure the cups are full, and sets the price at which the ale can be sold. If the ale is bad, the alewife is fined. If the measure is short, the alewife is fined. If the price is too high, the alewife is fined. The fines are recorded in the manor court rolls, and they are so frequent and so routine that some historians have suggested they function less as punishments and more as a kind of licensing fee, a regular payment that the alewife makes in exchange for the right to continue brewing and selling. Now the sun is going down. The light, which has been grey and soft all day, is fading to a deep, warm gold as the sun drops below the cloud line for a few brief minutes before sinking below the horizon. The fields are empty. The plow team has been unyoked and the oxen led back to their byre. The chickens have been shooed into their coop and the door secured against foxes. The cow has been milked for the second time and led into the byre beside the house, where she will stand through the night, her body heat contributing to the warmth of the household on the other side of the wall. The children have been called in from the common. The tools have been cleaned and put away, and the village is drawing inward, contracting, pulling itself into the warmth and the light of the hearths that burn in every house. And this is the hour that the medieval villager looks forward to all day. Not because it is the end of work, though it is, but because it is the beginning of something else. Something that has no name in medieval English but that we might call community, or fellowship, or simply being together, because the evening gathering around the fire is the social heart of medieval village life. The time when the scattered individuals who have been working alone or in small groups all day come together as a family, a household, a unit, and share the things that make them human. Food, drink, warmth, talk, laughter, and stories. The hearth is the centre of the evening just as it is the centre of the house. The fire has been built up with the last of the day's fuel, and it burns brightly, casting flickering orange light across the faces of the family gathered around it. The pottage has been eaten. The ale has been poured. The trenchers have been consumed, or, if they are too stale to eat, tossed to the dog that lies by the fire, its head on its paws, its eyes half closed, drowsing in the warmth. And someone begins to talk. The evening conversation in a medieval village is not what you might expect. It is not all pious reflection and solemn discussion of the harvest and the weather, though those subjects come up. It is also gossip. Delicious, malicious, irresistible gossip about the neighbours. Who was seen talking to whom at the well? Who has been brewing ale without putting up her bush? Who owes money to the reeve and has not paid? Whose cow broke through the hedge and got into the rector's garden? Whose daughter has been walking out with the miller's son, and what does her father think about that? The gossip is the village newspaper, the medium through which information circulates and reputations are made and destroyed. It is entertaining, and it is social, and it is also a mechanism of control, because the knowledge that your behavior is being observed and discussed and judged by your neighbors is a powerful incentive to behave well, or at least to behave carefully. But the evening also brings stories, real stories, not gossip, but narrative, and the storytelling tradition of medieval England is rich and deep and far more sophisticated than most modern people realize. The stories that are told around medieval hearth fires come from many sources. Some are local legends, tales of ghosts and fairies and supernatural beings that inhabit the landscape of the parish. The spirit that lives in the old oak tree at the crossroads, the fairy ring on the hill where you must never sleep on Midsummer's Eve, the ghostly procession of the dead that is sometimes seen on the road to the church at midnight. These stories are specific to the place, rooted in the geography of the parish, and they serve a purpose that goes beyond entertainment. They encode the community's relationship with the land, mapping the landscape with meaning and significance, marking certain places as sacred or dangerous or special. Some stories are drawn from the broader tradition of English folklore, the cycle of Robin Hood stories, which were already popular by the 14th century, tales of clever peasants outwitting stupid lords, of faithful lovers separated by misfortune and reunited by providence, of quests and adventures and miraculous transformations. These stories are told and retold, embellished and adapted, each teller adding their own flourishes and details, so that the same basic tale can sound completely different depending on who is telling it and who is listening. And some stories come from the church. The lives of the saints, in particular, are a rich source of narrative, full of miracles and martyrdom and dramatic encounters between good and evil. St. George and the Dragon, St. Christopher carrying the Christ child across the river, St. Margaret being swallowed by a dragon and bursting out of its belly unharmed. These stories are entertaining, but they are also instructive, offering models of virtuous behavior and warnings about the consequences of sin. The medieval villager lives in a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is thin and permeable, where miracles are not just possible but expected, and where the saints are not distant historical figures but present, active, powerful beings who can be appealed to for help and whose displeasure is to be feared. The storyteller is usually the oldest person in the household, the grandmother or the grandfather, whose body is too worn for field work, but whose memory is sharp and whose voice is strong. They sit closest to the fire, wrapped in a blanket or a cloak, and they speak in a slow, measured cadence that rises and falls with the rhythm of the narrative. The children sit at their feet, their eyes wide, their mouths open, absorbing the stories that will become part of their mental furniture, the narrative framework through which they will understand the world for the rest of their lives. And the adults listen too, not because they have not heard the stories before, they have, many times, but because the repetition is part of the pleasure. A familiar story, well told, is a comfort, a reassurance that the world is still the same, that the old truths still hold, that the things that mattered to your grandmother still matter to your. And gradually, as the fire burns lower and the ale takes effect and the warmth of the room and the drone of the storyteller's voice combine to produce a drowsiness that is impossible to resist, the household begins to settle for the night. The bedtime routine of a medieval household is simple and quick. There is no bathing, there is no teeth brushing, there is no changing into pajamas. You sleep in the clothes you wore during the day or in a shift, a simple linen undergarment that serves as both underwear and nightgown. You lie down on your straw mattress, which is on the floor near the hearth, and you pull the rough woolen blanket over yourself, and you arrange your body in the space that is available, which is not much because you are sharing the room and possibly the mattress with your entire family. Parents sleep together. Children sleep together, sometimes 2 or 3 to a mattress, arranged head to foot. The grandmother sleeps nearest the fire because the cold affects her most. The dog sleeps wherever it wants, usually as close to the fire as it can get without singeing its fur. The fire is banked for the night. This means that the burning logs are pushed together and covered with a thick layer of ash, which reduces the airflow and slows the combustion, allowing the fire to smoulder through the night without going out entirely. If the banking is done well, there will be glowing embers in the morning that can be coaxed back into flames without having to start from scratch with the fire steel and flint. If the banking is done poorly, the fire will go out, and the morning will begin with that frustrating time-consuming process of striking sparks and coaxing tinder that we talked about at the beginning of our journey. The last light of the day fades. The fire dims to a soft red glow beneath its blanket of ash. The room darkens, and the sounds of the household settle into the rhythms of sleep. Breathing, shifting. The occasional murmur of someone talking in their dreams. The scratch of a mouse in the thatch. The creak of the timber frame. And from outside, the sounds of the medieval night. The medieval night is not silent. It is a symphony of sounds that are utterly unlike the sounds of a modern night. There are no cars, no sirens, no aeronode, but there is wind, a constant presence in the English countryside, pressing against the walls of the house, rattling the wooden shutters, rushing through the bare branches of the trees with a sound like distant water. There is the hooting of an owl, hunting in the fields beyond the village, its call eerie and beautiful, and slightly unsettling in the darkness. There is the barking of a dog somewhere in the village, answered by another dog, and then another, a chain of barking that ripples through the settlement and then fades. There is the lowing of cattle in the byre, shifting in their stalls, chewing their cud, their presence a reassurance that the world is still in order, that the animals are safe, that the morning will come. And there is something else, something that is hard to describe because it has no modern equivalent. There is the sound of darkness itself, not silence, something deeper than silence. A quality of stillness that is so complete and so enveloping that it becomes a presence, a thing you can feel against your skin, a thing that fills the room and presses against the walls and lies heavy on your chest like a second blanket. Modern people almost never experience this quality of darkness and stillness, because our world is never truly dark and never truly still. There is always light. There is always noise. There is always something. But in a medieval village, when the fire is banked and the candle is out and the moon is behind the clouds, there is nothing. Nothing but the wind and the animals and the breathing of the people beside you and the immense, ancient, infinite darkness of a world that has not yet learned to hold back the night. And in that darkness, lying on your straw mattress, with the smoke-blackened rafters invisible above you and the embers glowing faintly in the hearth, you might think about the day. The fire that took 10 minutes to start, the pottage that tasted the same as yesterday and the day before, the field that you ploughed 1 furlong at a time behind the slow, patient oxen, the gossip at the well, the children chasing the dog, the bell ringing for vespers, the bread that was too hard, the ale that was almost sour, the story that your grandmother told, the same story she told last week and the week before, but somehow different each time, somehow new, and you might think about tomorrow, which will be almost exactly like today, the same fire, the same pottage, the same field, the same work, the same work, the same bell, the same bread, the same ale, the same story. The medieval villager's life is not a narrative of progress and change and novelty. It is a cycle, a wheel, an endless repetition of the same tasks, the same rituals, the same pleasures, the same hardships, turning and turning and turning, season after season, year after year, generation after generation, until the wheel stops and the cycle ends and another person takes your place in the field and by the fire and in the bed and the whole thing begins again. And there is something in that repetition, something in that turning wheel that is not sad but beautiful. Because the repetition is not meaningless. It is the rhythm of life itself, the rhythm of the seasons, the rhythm of the earth, the rhythm of planting and growing and harvesting and resting and planting again, the rhythm that your ancestors followed for 1,000 years, and that their ancestors followed for thousands of years before them, and that the earth itself has followed for billions of years, the slow, steady, patient cycle of growth and decay and renewal that is the heartbeat of the planet you live on. And now, tonight, lying in your own bed, in your own room, in your own house, in a world that is so different from the medieval village that it might as well be another planet, you are still part of that cycle. The bread you ate for dinner was made from wheat that was planted in a field and harvested in the autumn, just like the wheat in the medieval strip fields. The water you drank was drawn from the earth, just like the water from the medieval well. The clothes you are wearing were made from fibres, natural or synthetic, that were spun into thread and woven into cloth, just like the thread that the medieval woman spun on her drop spindle. The roof over your head keeps out the rain, just like the thatch on the medieval house. And the darkness outside your window is the same darkness that pressed against the medieval shutters, the same darkness that has fallen every night since the world began, the same darkness that will fall every night until the world ends. Everything changes, nothing changes, the wheel turns, and you are on it, just as they were, connected to them across the centuries by the simple, ordinary, extraordinary acts of living, eating, drinking, working, resting, telling stories, falling asleep. If you have been here for this entire journey, from the dark house at dawn to the dark house at dusk, from the first spark of the fire steel to the last glow of the banked embers, then you have done something rare. You have lived a day in another world. You have walked the muddy lanes and smelled the wood smoke and heard the church bell and tasted the pottage and felt the ache of muscles that have worked from sunrise to sunset, doing things that your body was never designed to do, but that your ancestors did every day of their lives. And that experience, that act of imagination, is not trivial. It is important. Because the medieval village is not just a curiosity from the past. It is the world that made you, the institutions you live under, the food systems that feed you, the social structures that organize your life, all of them have roots that reach back into the medieval village. You cannot understand the modern world without understanding the world that preceded it. And you cannot understand a medieval world without doing what we have done tonight, which is to slow down, to look closely, to pay attention to the small things, the ordinary things, the things that history books skip over because they are not dramatic enough or important enough or interesting enough to mentioning. But they are interesting. They are the most interesting things of all, because they are the things that most people actually experienced. The things that made up the texture and the flavor and the rhythm of daily life for millions of human beings across hundreds of years. And those lives matter. Every single one of them matters. Now, before the darkness takes you, before your eyes close and the medieval village fades and you drift away into the deep, warm, ancient sleep that the villagers knew and that you know, and that every human being who has ever lived has knew, and that you know, and that every human being who has ever lived has known, I want to ask you to do 3 things. First, subscribe. Because this journey we have taken tonight is only one of many. There are so many more worlds to visit, so many more days to live through, so many more stories to hear. The ancient world, the medieval world, the age of exploration, the Industrial Revolution, the rise and fall of empires. Every one of these periods has its own quiet days, its own ordinary mornings, its own fires and pottages and church bells and bedtime stories. And I want to take you to all of them. But I can only do that if you are here, and you can only be here if you subscribe. So do it now. It takes 1 second, 1 tap, and you become a permanent traveler on this journey through the human past. Second, leave a comment. Tell me something. Tell me which part of the medieval day you would have enjoyed most. Tell me which part you would have hated. Tell me whether you could survive a week in a medieval village, or whether you would give up by lunchtime on the first day. Tell me what you want to hear about next. Tell me anything. Because your comments are not just words on a screen. They are conversations. They are connections. They are connections. They are the modern equivalent of the evening gathering around the fire where people share their thoughts and their reactions and their questions and their laughter. And I value them more than you know. And third, if this story helped you relax, if it helped you slow down, if it carried you gently towards sleep, then share it with someone who needs the same thing. Someone who is lying awake tonight, staring at the ceiling, scrolling through their phone, looking for something that will quiet their mind and slow their breathing and carry them away from the noise and the speed and the relentless stimulation of the modern world. This video might be what they need. Send it to them, share it, pass it along. The way the medieval grandmother passed her stories along from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, keeping the old tales alive for one more night, one more listener, one more turn of the wheel. And now, if you are still hungry for more, if the medieval world has woken something in you that does not want to sleep just yet, then I have another journey waiting for you. Another world, another time, another quiet day in a place that history has forgotten. You will find it right here on this channel, and it is just as long and just as detailed and just as immersive as the one you have just experienced. Go there now, or save it for tomorrow night when the darkness falls again and you need another story to carry you away. The fire is almost out. The embers are fading, the wind is whispering in the thatch. The owl is hunting in the dark fields beyond the village. The cow is breathing slowly in the byre. The dog is twitching in its sleep, chasing something in a dream. And the village is quiet, not silent, never silent, but quiet. Not silent, but quiet. The deep, rich, living quiet of a world that knows how to rest. Close your eyes. The wheel turns. The morning will come, but not yet. Not yet. Good night.